Hello everyone, it's Mr. Brown and I'm here again with Emil and the Detectives. I'm going to read you chapter 4 today. Chapter 4 is called A Wild Nightmare. As you'll know, he's been on the train with Mr. Grunt Ice, and I think I'm right in saying at the end of the last chapter, even though he really didn't want to, he dozed off, he fell asleep. So I wonder what's going to happen now. You might be able to predict what's going to happen. But let's see. Chapter 4, A Wild Nightmare. It seemed to Emil all of a sudden that the train was going round in a circle, like a toy train on the floor. He looked out of the window and saw the engine drawing the train round and getting nearer and nearer and nearer to the last carriage. It seemed to be doing it quite deliberately, like a puppy trying to catch its own tail. And within the black circle of the railway lines he could see trees and a windmill made of glass and a building quite 200 floors high. Emil tried to take his watch out of his pocket to see the time, but he had to tug and tug at it and found himself at last bringing out the big clock from the sitting room at home. On its face was written 150 hours per mile. Danger! Do not spit on the floor. He leaned out of the window again and saw that the engine was catching up on the last carriage, and they were coming closer and closer together. At any minute now they would crash. He could not bear to sit still and wait for it, so he opened the door, stepped carefully out, and set off along the footboard towards the engine. He thought perhaps the driver had fallen asleep. He looked quickly into the carriage windows as he went by, but everyone seemed to be empty. There was in fact no one in the whole train but himself and a man wearing a bowler hat made of chocolate. Emil saw him break off a piece of the brim and eat it. He tapped on the window and pointed towards the engine, but the man only laughed and broke off another piece of chocolate and patted his stomach to show how good it tasted. At last Emil reached the coal bunker, and with a mighty heave pulled himself up and struggled over to join the engine driver, who was sitting on the box seat of a horse carriage, holding reins in one hand and a whip in the other, as though the horses were pulling the train. And, in fact, they were. 9 of them were harnessed to the engine. They had silvery roller skates on their hooves and raced along the tracks singing a popular song. Emil shook the man and cried, "Stop! Stop! Or there'll be an accident!" And then he found it was Sergeant Jeschke. He was shaking, and Jeschke's eyes pierced through him, and Jeschke's voice boomed, "Who chalked the moustache on the Grand Duke's face?" I did, Emil confessed. "Who helped you?" "I won't tell you." "Then we shall go on forever driving round in this circle." With that the sergeant whipped up his horses so that they reared up on their hind legs, then galloped on faster than ever towards the tail coach. And there, on top of it, sat Mrs. Jacob, looking frightened to death and brandishing her shoes at the horses, who were snapping at her heels. "I'll give you a whole pound if you'll stop," cried Emil. "Don't talk such nonsense," Jeschke shouted back, lashing away at the horses like one possessed. Emil could bear it no longer. He jumped off the train and turned head over heels about 20 times on his way down the slope, but without hurting himself. He lay there a moment, looking up at the train. It had stopped too, and the 9 horses were all turning their heads to look at him. Sergeant Jeschke then jumped up, slashed at the horses with his whip and yelled, "After him! After him!" And the 9 horses leapt off the rails and rushed down the slope after Emil, with the carriages bouncing about like rubber balls behind him. Emil didn't stop to think. He just ran as fast as his legs would carry him, across the meadow, past some trees, and over a stream towards a tall building. Now and again he glanced over his shoulder, and he saw the train still thundering after him. It drove straight at the trees and smashed them to matchwood. Only one, a giant oak, was left standing, and perched on top of it sat the large Mrs. Jacob, swaying to and fro as the wind blew the branches, and crying because she couldn't get her shoes on. Emil ran on until he reached the building, dashed through the big black entrance door, and went on running until he came out on the other side. He longed for some quiet spot where he could lie down and sleep, for he was tired out and trembling all over, but he dared not even stop for a moment. The train was clattering through the building already, close behind him. There was an iron fire-escape ladder going up the outside wall, and Emil started up it without losing a second. Luckily, he was good at gymnastics. He counted the floors as he passed them, but did not stop to look down until he reached the 50th. He turned his head then, and found that the trees had grown quite tiny, and the glass windmill so small that he hardly recognised it. Then, to his horror, he saw that the train was climbing up after him, as though the sides of the ladder were rails. On he rushed, as fast as he could go. He passed the 100th floor, the 120th, 140th, 160th, 180th, 190th, 200th, and that was the top. He stopped, went out onto the roof, and stood there, what to do next. The horses were neighing close behind him. He ran across to the far side. Then, in desperation, he took his handkerchief from his pocket, shook it out, and, just as the sweating horses came up over the edge of the roof with the train clattering after them, he spread it out over his head like a parachute and jumped into space. He heard the train knocking down chimney stacks, then heard and saw no more until, with a crash, he landed in the middle of the meadow. He lay still for a while, with eyes closed, tired out. The quiet of that moment felt like a blissful dream. Yet the feeling of anxiety persisted, and he still had to close his eyes to see what was happening on the roof. He was just in time to see the 9 horses opening umbrellas. Sergeant Jeschke had an umbrella too, and was waving it about as he urged the horses on. They drew back on their haunches, and then took a mighty leap, still pulling the train, and it came floating down towards the meadow, getting bigger and bigger as they came nearer the spot where Emil was lying. He got to his feet in a hurry, and raced across the meadow to the glass windmill. Through its transparent walls he saw, to his great surprise, his mother washing Mrs. Augustine's hair. Oh, thank goodness, he thought, and ran inside by the back door. Oh, Mum, he cried, whatever shall I do? What's the matter, son? Asked his mother, going calmly on with her work. Look, he gasped, through the wall. Mrs. Tischbein turned her head just in time to see the horses and the train land in the meadow and come charging towards the mill at great pace. Why, that's Sergeant Jeschke, she exclaimed, greatly surprised. Yes, he's been chasing me all over the place, said Emil. Why, what have you been up to? She asked. The other day I put a red nose and a black moustache on the face of the Grand Duke Charles's statue. Where else would you put a moustache, I'd like to know, if not on a face? Asked Mrs. Augustine, laughing. Nowhere else, of course, said Emil, but he wants to know who was there with me, and I won't say. Quite right, said his mother. Never tell tales. But what are we to do now? Just start the engine, Mrs. Tischbein, said Mrs. Augustine. Emil's mother pressed a lever at the side of the table, and the 4 sails of the windmill began to turn. The sun caught the glass they were made of, so that when the horses came up, the blinding light made them rear up and shy, and they refused to go another step. Sergeant Jeschke swore so loudly that they could all hear him through the glass walls, but the horses would not budge. That will do, said Mrs. Augustine. You can go on washing my hair now. Emil's quite safe. So Mrs. Tischbein got on with her job, and Emil sat down on a glass chair and began to whistle. This is wonderful, he said, chuckling. If I'd have known you were here, I should never have climbed up that awful skyscraper. I hope you haven't torn your suit, said his mother. And what about the money? Is it still in your pocket? These words gave Emil such a shock that he fell off his seat with a crash and woke up. And that's the end of chapter 4, A Wild Nightmare. In the book there are occasionally a few illustrations, and here, I don't know if you'll see it very clearly, there's the illustration of the skyscraper and the horses pulling the train, and they've done they're 3 or 4 throughout the book so far, but that's the one for this chapter. The next chapter is chapter 5, and that's called The Chase Begins, and I'll read that ready for you tomorrow. Okay, stay safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.